Over the last 15 years, several reports have highlighted the potential hazards of human spaceflight and the ethical obligations that we have as a nation and the additional steps that we might take and need to take to address gaps in meeting these obligations. From the dynamic launch environment to the unforgiving vacuum of space to the energetic re-entry to Earth, human spaceflight has always placed astronauts in the challenging environments. Even training for spaceflight carries significant risks. Up until recently, however, space travel was measured in days. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and the Space Shuttle program placed astronauts in space for relatively short periods of time. Now, with the completion of the International Space Station, our astronauts now spend months in space. The risks and potential impacts on our astronauts' health are not always seen immediately. Captain Scott Kelly recently returned from the ISS after spending 340 days in space on one mission. This put his cumulative time in space at 520 days. Extended missions like his are teaching us a lot about the long-term effects of human spaceflight. Weightlessness leads to osteoporosis, the loss in bone density. Long-duration space missions also seem to impact vision, as 60% of ISS astronauts report worsening eyesight. Furthermore, radiation exposure increases the likelihood of cancer. These are just some of the conditions that we know about. Staying in space longer and pushing farther into deep space will likely present additional risks. And while NASA attempts to mitigate these risks with protocols and countermeasures, such as exercise, drug treatments, and spacecraft shielding, there will probably always be a cost to our astronauts that they bear for traveling in space. This raises several fundamental questions. For instance, is the request for additional authority simply about treating former astronauts, or is it also about NASA getting better data on human spaceflight? Are these two issues related? Are there classes of astronauts, such as payload specialists, who are not government employees that aren't covered by existing authorities? How should NASA administer treatment? Should they do it in-house or simply reimburse patients for this treatment? If NASA decided to diagnose conditions in-house, does this pose a potential conflict of interest when NASA is financially obligated to compensate former astronauts for conditions caused by their federal service? How would additional authority affect existing rights and benefits under current statutes? How would creating a new program at NASA impact the causation standard set forth by the Departments of Labor, the Departments of Labor and Veterans Affairs? In other words, will a new authority make it easier or harder for astronauts to receive treatment and compensation? In order to address these questions, Congress included a provision in the 2005 NASA Authorization Act that asked for a plan on how to best provide for former astronaut care. Similarly, the most recent Authorization Act that received unanimous support in the House awaits consideration by the Senate. It contained a provision asking for cost estimates for expanding treatment. I think everyone here wants to make sure that we are doing right by our astronauts. They put themselves in harm's way to advance our knowledge of the universe and by bringing great pride to our nation. I'm also very proud to say that I represent a great number of these astronauts who call Houston their home. As a healthcare professional myself, and as their representative, you could say that it's my duty, emphatically, to make sure these folks are being taken care of properly. But this isn't simply about addressing a moral and ethical obligation. There's also a great benefit that we receive from providing this care. The long-term health information gained by providing treatment to former astronauts will give us a greater understanding of radiation exposure, vision impairment, bone loss, and many other ailments. This, in turn, will assist us to develop better monitoring and treatment protocols here on Earth for everyone, not just astronauts. I thank today's witnesses for joining us as we discuss these very, very significant and important issues, and I look forward to hearing your testimony and your answers to our questions. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Maryland, for an opening statement.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to extend a welcome to our distinguished panel this afternoon, and thank you as well for your patience. Human spaceflight is inherently risky. That's why NASA exercises diligence and caution during all phases of space mission, including training, vehicle flight testing, launch, mission operations, and landing. In addition to mission risks, astronauts bear significant personal risk, particularly as related to their health. Health risks during long-duration flights include both short-term health consequences as well as potential long-term health conditions that may arise months and sometimes years after an astronaut's service. This is a problem. Because of the small number of U.S. astronauts who've flown in space and the corresponding small data set currently available on astronaut exposure during long-duration flights, characterizing those risks is a major challenge for NASA. However, if we were to go to Mars, as I've strongly advocated, mitigating these health risks is critical. But we also need to ensure that the risks NASA astronauts take are recognized and addressed by the American people. While active astronauts receive comprehensive health care, former astronauts do not. This needs to change. We need to ensure that care is provided for all of our NASA astronauts, not just those who are on active status. Providing ongoing medical care for active and former astronauts will give NASA the needed insight to enable earlier detection and treatment of any potential medical problems that could result from human spaceflight. It will also provide NASA with the data that are necessary to help mitigate against health risks related to future human space exploration. This is also a recommendation of the 2014 National Academies report, which concluded that lifetime health care for astronauts is our ethical responsibility. The report's principle of fidelity recognizes that, quote, given the risks that astronauts accept in participating in hazardous mission, NASA should respect the mutuality of obligations and ensure health care and protection for astronauts not only during the mission but after return, including provision of lifetime care for astronauts. NASA responded to the National Academy's report by proposing a legislative change that would give NASA the authority to provide medical monitoring, diagnosis, and treatment for psychological and medical conditions that are deemed by NASA to be associated with human spaceflight. It's worth noting that, as the chairman indicated, the Bipartisan NASA Authorization Act of 2015, H.R. 810, that was passed by the House in February 2015, directs NASA to provide a formal response to the National Academy's report. This response, as directed in the legislation, must include the budgetary resources required for implementation of the report's recommendations, as well as any options that might be considered as part of the response. Had that bill been enacted, it is likely that our discussion here today would have been much better informed. That said, Mr. Chairman, it's clear to me that ensuring comprehensive care of our astronauts before, during, and after their active service is a high priority. NASA's legislative proposal provides one option for addressing this issue, and I hope we can explore other options as well. However, the impact each option would have on existing authorities warrants careful consideration. For example, should Congress direct NASA to provide astronauts with lifetime health care in return for their service to the nation? Under this scenario, how would existing astronaut health care support systems be affected, including those provided by the Veterans Administration for former military astronauts? Or should Congress pattern astronaut care after NASA's legislative proposal by directing NASA to provide enhanced medical screening that would facilitate claims made by former astronauts for occupational health conditions under the FECA and VA processes, and provide proactive diagnosis and treatment if needed while those FECA and VA processes are underway? In either scenario, how would such authority be implemented? In addition, we need to clarify how NASA intends to establish the causality link between human spaceflight and any identified psychological and medical conditions astronauts may develop. The bottom line here is that we need to do the right thing. And so, Mr. Chairman, if the committee intends to address the issues contained in NASA's proposals, I would hope that we could craft legislation on a bipartisan basis, and I look forward to working with you. Thank you, and with that, I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Edwards. I now recognize the chairman of our full committee, Mr. Smith from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to all of our witnesses today, including 3 astronauts. I often say publicly, and I'll say again now, that I consider astronauts to be our modern heroes for many, many reasons, and certainly appreciate their presence here today. Mr. Chairman, I also believe this is probably the first hearing we have had dedicated entirely to the subject of astronauts' health in space. And so it's most timely, and as you and the ranking member both mentioned, it might lead to legislation that can be helpful to them in the future. Since NASA selected the first group of astronauts in 1959, more than 300 of America's finest have ventured into the cosmos as explorers. Each one of these astronauts represents the compelling urge of humankind to explore and to discover, and the lure of curiosity that leads us to try to go where no one has gone before. From Neil Armstrong's first step on the moon to Captain Kelly's one-year voyage on the International Space Station, their peaceful exploration of outer space continues to inspire our nation and the world. In an age when spaceflight has come to seem almost routine, it is easy to overlook how dangerous it is and how little we know about the long-term health effects of spaceflight. For almost 20 years, astronauts have lived on the International Space Station. One of their primary missions has been to learn about the psychological and physiological effects of long-duration human space flight. Captain Kelly's one-year mission was in pursuit of a scientific understanding of how the human body responds to extended space flight. But even with our 20 years of experience on the ISS, we are only just beginning to understand the effects of long-duration missions. Our lack of knowledge becomes especially evident as NASA prepares for its journey to Mars. Only 24 individuals have journeyed beyond low Earth orbit. All of these astronauts flew during the Apollo era and never for more than a handful of days. Using our current propulsion technology, a successful mission to Mars will require astronauts to survive a round-trip spaceflight of no less than several hundred days. And unlike our near-Earth environment, the trip to Mars will offer no natural protection from galactic cosmic rays and solar radiation. Today, through its lifetime surveillance of astronaut health program, NASA screens and monitors astronauts for occupational-related injury or disease. This program contributes to our scientific knowledge of long-term health effects and assists participating astronauts in monitoring for spaceflight-related illnesses and disease. But this program does not provide for diagnosis or treatment of those no longer serving, nor for management and retired astronauts, because NASA is not explicitly authorized to provide such services. These astronauts can receive treatment from the Department of Labor or the Veterans Administration now, but this may not be the best process for the former astronauts or NASA's developing knowledge base. We as a nation have a responsibility to ensure that our astronauts, both active and retired, are provided with appropriate monitoring, diagnosis, and treatment of spaceflight-related injuries and disease. This is also the recommendation of the National Academy of Sciences in its review of NASA's study of astronaut health. For our nation, the question should not be whether we should provide these services to our astronauts, but rather how to do it in a way that best addresses the current and future needs of our space explorers in their quest for discovery of new frontiers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee for a statement, Ms. Johnson from Texas.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Let me welcome our distinguished witnesses. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing on human spaceflight ethics and obligations, options and monitoring, diagnosing, and treatment of former astronauts. Our NASA astronauts are American heroes, and they're some of the most accomplished, highly trained, and courageous individuals who serve our nation in the pursuit of furthering our exploration of outer space. Astronauts in our human space program also inspire the next generation, with many of our youngest Americans dreaming of one day following in their footsteps and exploring out of space. And I might add that no child falls asleep when there's an astronaut speaking in high schools. It is no surprise that our astronauts are held in very, very high regard. They accept considerable risk in doing their jobs and serving our nation. And over the decades that we have been sending humans into outer space, more than a dozen NASA astronauts have paid the ultimate price as part of this service. That's why I'm pleased that we are examining the responsibility we have to care for our astronauts even after they have left active status, including looking at the risk of cancer, musculoskeletal conditions, and ocular disorders are just a few of the known health concerns related to human spaceflight. But there is still much that we are learning and need to learn about the potential effects on space, on the human body, and on human health. Congress has acted to ensure that others we have put in harm's way, such as those who have served in our military, receive lifetime health care. It is time we do the same for NASA astronauts. The practicalities of how we authorize the provision of such a health care is very important, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on key questions and issues that Congress needs to consider before we legislate in this area. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. Now, I'd like to introduce our panel of distinguished witnesses. Our first witness today is Dr. Richard Williams, Chief Health and Medical Officer for NASA. In this role, Dr. Williams is responsible for the oversight of all health and medical activities at NASA, including the medical aspects of all national and international NASA missions involving humans. He has extensive experience in the clinical practice of general surgery, aerospace medicine, and occupational medicine, as well as in administrative medical management. During his 27-year Air Force career, Dr. Williams served in a wide variety of settings as a clinical practitioner and medical leader, including service in the contingency deployments. Dr. Williams holds an MD degree from the Virginia Commonwealth University and completed residencies in general surgery at Wright State University and in aerospace medicine and occupational medicine at the United States Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas. Thank you for being here. Second witness today is Captain Chris Cassidy, a United States Navy SEAL and the 16th Chief of the Astronaut Office at NASA. As NASA's chief astronaut, he is responsible for flight assignments, mission preparation, and on-orbit support of U.S. crews, as well as organizing astronaut office support for future launch vehicles. Captain Cassidy was selected as an astronaut by NASA in 2004, and he's a veteran of 2 space flights, STS-127 and Expedition 35. During STS-127, Cassidy served as a mission specialist and was the 500th person in history to fly into space. Captain Cassidy has been deployed twice to the Mediterranean and twice to Afghanistan. He is the recipient of the Bronze Star with a Combat V and Presidential Unit Citation for leading a 9-day operation at the Zarwar Kili Cave on the Afghanistan-Pakistani border. Captain Cassidy received a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from the U.S. Naval Academy and a Master of Science in Ocean Engineering from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thank you for being here. I'm the proud father of a Navy SEAL myself. Captain Scott Kelly. Our third witness today is Captain Scott Kelly, a retired U.S. naval officer and former NASA astronaut who is fresh off his 1-year mission in space. Welcome home, Captain Kelly. I've had the distinct pleasure and honor of meeting and visiting with Captain Kelly on several occasions before and after his historic mission. In 1996, Captain Kelly was selected by NASA. He has logged more than 520 days in space on 4 space flights and served as space shuttle pilot on STS-103 in 1999 and was the mission commander on STS-118 in 2007. Captain Kelly also served as a flight engineer for ISS Expedition 25 and as the commander of ISS Expedition 26. In March of 2015, Captain Kelly launched for a one-year mission to the ISS, serving as a flight engineer for increments 43 and 44 and commander for increments 45 and 46. Captain Kelly returned to Earth on March the 2nd, 2016, after his historic 340-day mission aboard the ISS. Captain Kelly received a Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical Engineering from the State University of New York Maritime College and a Master of Science degree in Aviation Systems from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Thanks for being here, Captain Kelly. Our fourth witness today is Captain Michael Lopez-Alegria, President of the Association of Space Explorers, USA, a retired U.S. naval officer and former NASA astronaut. Captain Lopez-Alegria has over 35 years of aviation and space experience with the U.S. Navy and NASA in a variety of roles, including naval aviator, engineering test pilot, and program manager, NASA astronaut, and International Space Station commander. He is a four-time astronaut, having flown on Space Shuttle missions STS-73, STS-92, and STS-113, and serving as commander of ISS Expedition 14, flying to and from the ISS aboard Soyuz TMA-9. He holds NASA records for the most extravehicular activities or spacewalks or EVAs, 10 EVAs, and cumulative EVA time of 67 hours and 40 minutes. Captain Lopez-Alegria received a Bachelor of Science and Systems Engineering from the U.S. Naval Academy and Master of Science in Aeronautical Engineering from the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. He is also a graduate of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government Program for Senior Executives in National and International Security. Thank you for being here today, Captain. Our final witness today is Dr. Jeffrey Kahn, professor of bioethics and public policy at Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics and chairman of the Committee on Ethics Principles and Guidelines for Health Standards for Long Duration and Exploration Space Flights for the Board on Health Sciences Policy at the National Academy of Science. His research interests include the ethics of research, ethics in public health, and ethics in emerging biomedical technologies. Dr. Kahn speaks widely, both in the U.S. and abroad, and has published 4 books and over 125 articles in the bioethics and medical literature. Dr. Kahn received his BA from the University of California, Los Angeles, PhD from Georgetown University, and MPH from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. The committee also invited a representative from the Department of Labor to discuss how the Department of Labor currently provides for treatment for federal employees under the Federal Employee Claims Act, or FECA. The committee sent Secretary Paris, or anyone in the agency that he would like to designate, an invitation to appear. Unfortunately, the Department of Labor could not find anyone to appear, which is very surprising since there are 17,000 employees at the Department of Labor. Furthermore, we only asked them to comment on what they already do. Executive branch officials have a responsibility to Congress and to the taxpayers of the United States to provide testimony and inform the legislative process. I am disappointed that a federal agency was unable to assist Congress, failing to fulfill this fundamental responsibility. It is no wonder that NASA wants to handle these issues themselves. I would now like to recognize Dr. Williams for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the critical issue of astronaut health care. This is an issue that has consumed me in my role as Chief Health and Medical Officer for NASA, and I am very grateful that the committee is using its limited time and resources to focus on this critical agency priority. Astronauts are exposed to unique hazards that no one else on Earth has experienced. Microgravity and space radiation are just 2 of the exposures that are only found when we venture into space. Some conditions, such as reduced muscle mass caused by exposure to microgravity, are somewhat foreseeable, while others are complete surprises. Certainly, the visual problems and increased risk of cataracts astronauts experience was not expected or predicted. For active astronauts, NASA currently provides medical care and treatment. We also use data from the treatment of active astronauts to figure out ways to minimize negative impacts to astronaut health. Some of the things we do include monitoring for radiation exposure, using exercise to combat microgravity effects, and continued health monitoring. While these efforts can't entirely mitigate exposure to space, they are valuable. However, when it comes to former astronauts, the situation is different. We invite astronauts to participate in our voluntary lifetime surveillance of astronaut health program. This includes a limited health status evaluation on an annual basis at the Johnson Space Center Flight Medical Clinic. However, if there are questions or concerns from this evaluation, NASA can only encourage astronauts to follow up with their personal health care providers. This presents a number of problems. NASA cannot do all the tests it believes need to be done to effectively monitor former astronauts, as some of these tests would be considered personal health care. If personal physicians do tests and evaluations, we often do not have access to the data unless the astronaut aggressively pursues getting this data to us. And healthcare providers often don't understand the need for some of the targeted tests that we require for occupational health surveillance and would not routinely order them. For example, some astronauts should probably be receiving yearly MRI scans of the area around their eyes. MRI scans are not normally used as preventive screening. They are usually ordered in response to illness or injury. I need to emphasize how small this population is. There are only 280 living astronauts that have flown in space. 280. That isn't even enough to take a good consumer product survey, let alone try to predict what effects human spaceflight might have on the human body 10, 20, or 30 years down the road. An average doctor or nurse practitioner, no matter how skilled they are, has no exposure to or understanding of these issues. With only 280 people to collect data from, we need to get as much data as possible from every one of them. With only 60% of our former astronauts participating in the current surveillance program, expanding our authority to provide for extensive testing would be a great incentive to increase this number. We believe 80% or more would participate if our authority to provide testing and monitoring was expanded. Being able to gather data on astronauts' medical conditions and understand the health impact of spaceflight exposures over time is essential to provide crew health and safety during long-term journeys beyond low Earth orbit. If we're serious about going anywhere beyond low Earth orbit, we'll need to understand these risks. Ethically, we will make sure all decisions astronauts make about their health care and personal information are completely voluntary. This brings me to an issue that may even be more important than our need for data, and that is our ethical obligation to our astronauts. When the United States government puts individuals in harm's way, our government has an obligation to care for them. Our military personnel are provided the care they need for the hazards and dangers they have faced in service to our country. The Institute of Medicine has, in multiple studies, pointed out that NASA has an ethical obligation to the astronauts who have dared exposures no other human beings in history have faced. To meet the health needs of our astronauts and to live up to our ethical obligations, I urge Congress to act to ensure we can safeguard the well-being of our former and future astronauts. Mr. Chairman, I would be glad to answer any question you or any other member might have.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. I now recognize Captain Cassidy for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I sincerely appreciate the chance to appear before you today. Thank you very much. As the chief astronaut for NASA, this issue is not only critically important to the agency, but also of great importance to myself, both professionally and personally. In my role as the chief, I serve as the most senior leadership position for active astronauts. I'm the principal advisor to Administrator Bolden through NASA leadership in the chain of command on all aspects of astronaut operations. This covers a wide variety of tasks, from astronaut training, operations, and safety, to advising on spacecraft design, and even finding astronauts to speak in order to inspire our nation's students and the public and to keep those high school students from falling asleep. We take health care very, very seriously. Other than our crew, the most precious resource on the International Space Station is time. We have an international mix of 6 crew members on the space station, and each of them has only 16 hours of awake time per day. Every minute of this period is treated as a critical resource, similar to that of air, water, or food. This time is used to accomplish the hundreds of scientific experiments to execute the many tasks required to keep the ISS functioning, yet we still schedule 2 hours of exercise every single day. This is done simply because it's the best way we have found to counteract the effects of microgravity exposure. Without a doubt, there are many other tasks that could be accomplished with those 2 hours. However, absolutely nothing is more important than keeping our astronauts as healthy as we possibly can. Our knowledge of the kinds of health challenges associated with the exposure to space has increased as more astronauts fly on the space station. Conditions have surfaced after long-duration spaceflight that were not apparent in short-term space exposure. For example, muscle atrophy and the associated bone loss have been experienced on longer-duration flights that were not a concern on shorter missions. There are other major risks to long-term exposure to space. There is far more radiation in space without the protection of Earth's magnetic field. There is also experimental evidence that radiation encountered in space, as compared to gamma or X-rays commonly encountered on Earth, is more effective at causing the type of biological damage that ultimately leads to cancer. This means that astronauts need to be more closely monitored for cancer for the rest of their lives versus someone who has not flown in space. Right now, NASA only has limited authority to provide medical monitoring for former astronauts. Our current program, the Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health, does basic health screening, but can't provide for the advanced monitoring and testing that is needed. Expanding the tests and conditions NASA can proactively monitor would greatly assist in establishing the evidence base that we need. It would also increase the numbers of astronauts who participate. With only about 280 living people who have flown in space, about 60% of those former astronauts participating in a limited health evaluation, every additional astronaut who can be part of this population is vital. The other reason for doing this extensive monitoring is to catch medical conditions in the early stages before they become more serious. Proactive monitoring gives us a much better chance of treating diseases in the early stages with a greater likelihood for a positive outcome. The lack of advanced monitoring worries me for another reason. We're involved in helping to evaluate our new generation of spacecraft, and the lack of data hampers us in our efforts to go beyond low Earth orbit. How do we design vehicles to protect against the long-term effects of microgravity and radiation exposure if we still aren't certain of what those effects entirely are? I work with our astronaut corps on a daily basis. This isn't just an abstract issue for me. I know these men and women and their families, their dedication, enthusiasm, bravery, and diligence. While they voluntarily accept the risks and dangers of spaceflight, that should not be an excuse to not be thorough with their health. We need to do everything in our power to understand and minimize the hazards they face in order to further protect future generations of Americans who will one day live off of our planet. Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer your questions, and I look forward to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Cassidy. I really appreciate that. And now I recognize Captain Kelly for his 5 minutes.
And Mr. Chairman, I have a short video, if you don't mind, an introduction video. Throughout history, people have done things that are risky. Even though it is a risky thing to be doing, and I think it's a lot more risky than some people might think, I still think it's worth it.
Astronaut Scott Kelly will try something no American has ever done before. This spring, he will leave for a mission and spend a year in space. His twin is former astronaut Mark Kelly.
Genetically, the brothers are almost identical, so scientists will be able to measure how Scott and Mark change physically and emotionally as months pass.
Warm up a little bit. This one's a bit of a Hail Mary. Here we go. Boom! Astronaut Scott Kelly at the International Space Station.
Scott Kelly has been working toward this mission his entire career. He's been working toward this mission his entire life in some respects.
I decided that the challenges staying in space for a whole year presented was appealing to me, even considering the sacrifices.
The human body was made for living in gravity, Strange things happen to us when we spend long periods of time without it. But that never deterred the former Navy test pilots from dreaming of becoming astronauts.
Pretty much anything we've ever put our mind to, we've been able to accomplish. Doing pretty good. I do feel like I've been up here for a really long time, and I look forward to getting home soon.
Interesting to watch. What a great story. Great story and a fascinating experiment.
Space is still the most exciting thing I can imagine, and talking to someone in orbit still is, it's like I am an astronaut right now.
Are you concerned about the toll, the physical toll that this will take on you?
I do think about the effects of radiation. You know, the reason I'm here is to learn more about it, so someday we can travel further from low Earth orbit than we ever have before. A year is not short, but it was very rewarding. It was enjoyable. It was something that I feel privileged to having got to do.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the importance of understanding the medical impacts of human spaceflight on astronauts and the proposed legislation on astronaut health. This issue is of critical importance to me and to our nation's future space exploration initiatives. I recently returned with my colleague, Russian cosmonaut Mikhail Kornienko, from nearly a year in space aboard the International Space Station, which serves as our best asset for understanding how human physiology behaves in a microgravity environment. Until at least 2024, the space station will continue to provide a platform for research on astronaut health and many other scientific investigations. The major objective of this year in space mission was to expand the experience and knowledge base required to safely send humans deeper into our solar system. A Mars mission is no easy feat and could require astronauts to be in space for 3 years or more. During this mission, we conducted more than 400 experiments in the fields of biology, material sciences, chemistry, and physics. Many of these experiments focus on how the human body responds to weightlessness and other effects of long-duration spaceflight. One of these experiments, which was dubbed the twin study, gave researchers the unique opportunity to study my physiology while I was in space compared to my twin brother, retired astronaut and Navy Captain Mark Kelly, who was on Earth. Data acquired from this year in space mission will help NASA make determinations that will directly affect decisions regarding crew safety in the years to come in areas from the design of future spacecraft to medical and psychological risk mitigation. Although I've been home for 100 days, much of the data is still being analyzed by researchers from around the world. You know, much attention is paid to the risks astronauts face while launching aboard rockets or returning to Earth in a giant fireball. Much less attention is given to the other risks we face, which are much more insidious but potentially just as fatal. The environment astronauts are exposed to while in space is unlike anything we experience here on Earth. Specifically, we're exposed to high levels of radiation and carbon dioxide, and a microgravity environment which causes loss of bone and muscle, vision impairment, and effects on our immune system, to name just a few. Yeah, these are very real issues that need to be solved before the human race is able to reach destinations beyond the Earth and the Moon. When I returned after 340 days, I was surprised how differently I felt compared to my long-duration mission of 159 days. My muscles more quickly stiffened, and because my skin hadn't touched anything for nearly a year, it was extremely sensitive and became inflamed. I developed a hive-like rash on every surface of my skin that came in contact with ordinary surfaces on Earth during normal activities like sitting or lying in bed. My legs were swollen due to the fluid shift imposed upon my body by gravity. I even had flu-like symptoms that appear to have been a result from my extended time in space. Exposure to the space environment has permanent effects we simply do not fully understand. The lifetime surveillance of astronaut health program NASA has in place to study astronaut long-term health is too limited to provide the data needed to ensure the safety of our space explorers. If we are to go beyond low Earth orbit, NASA needs the ability to proactively and aggressively monitor, diagnose, and treat astronauts who serve our country in the name of science and exploration. Expanding health care coverage for our U.S. astronaut corps will enable NASA to more effectively and efficiently support it and collect the data necessary to push out further into our solar system. Furthermore, continued investigation of space-related ailments and mitigation steps will help in treating similar ailments on Earth, such as osteoporosis, muscle wasting diseases, high blood pressure, glaucoma, and certain brain disease, to name just a few. There are already FDA-approved treatment modalities which are a result of space-based research. Although Mars and other long-term NASA objectives seem to be many years ahead of us, laying a secure foundation for astronaut health is imperative to the continuance of our nation's ability to explore. Healthcare for our astronauts is critically important. Our astronauts are exposed to numerous health risk factors while in space, and while we are aware of some of the impacts, we just need more data from astronauts in space and on the ground to better understand these negative effects of this harsh environment. The proposed legislation on astronaut health will not only help us learn more about the impacts of human spaceflight, but also will serve to protect the health of those who push the boundaries in the name of exploration on behalf of our nation. And we are on the cusp of a new space age, one in which greater numbers of Americans will travel to space and go further than ever before. I was honored to play a small role in paving the way for those future pioneers, but want to make it clear, this year in space mission was not my achievement. It was the achievement of thousands of dedicated professionals that believe, like I do, that the benefit of human spaceflight is vital to the continued success and development of our nation and our species. Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to respond to any questions you or other members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Kelly. We really appreciate your testimony. And now I recognize Dr. Kahn for 5 minutes. Excuse me, I'm sorry, Captain Lopez-Alegria. I apologize.
All right, thanks, Chairman Babin, Ranking Member Edwards, and Chairman Smith, and Ranking Member Johnson, and all the members of the subcommittee. Thanks for organizing this hearing and for asking me to give you some comments on the proposed legislative language as the president of the USA chapter of the Association of Space Explorers. The ASC is an international, nonprofit, professional, and educational organization that has only one prerequisite for membership, having made at least one orbit of the Earth in space. Our vision is a world where living, working, and exploring in space will be as familiar to humanity as life on our home planet. We count among our members over 400 current and former astronauts and cosmonauts from 37 nations and are organized into 4 regional chapters: Russia, Europe, Asia, and ASC USA, by far the largest, with 214 living members. There's a standing joke at the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston that if you ask 5 astronauts for their opinion on an issue, you'll get at least 6 answers. Nonetheless, the response I received from the membership of ASC USA was absolute unanimity in support of the change that would allow NASA to provide enhanced monitoring, diagnosis, and treatment of the effects of health hazards that are associated with having flown in space. I heard from former astronauts who left the agency from several months to several decades ago, and many of the stories were strikingly similar. My written statement mentions some of the known health hazards that are unique to the spaceflight environment, and members of the ASC USA convincingly confirmed that that list is real, with many personal accounts of musculoskeletal, vision, bone density, and most grimly, cancer-related medical issues. In some cases, their maladies were flagged during annual exams that are offered by NASA as part of the lifetime surveillance of astronaut health, but in all cases, further diagnosis and any treatment is at the expense of the astronaut. There is ample precedent for targeted surveillance and treatment for occupationally related medical conditions, both within the government, for instance, healthcare for veterans, as well as screening for DOE and DOD nuclear workers, as well as by non-government employers for their workers in mines, foundries, and in the civilian nuclear power industry. But as compelling as some of my former colleagues' medical situations are, the most persuasive argument for this type of legislation is that understanding the human physiological response to spaceflight is imperative to inform future policies and procedures for managing health risks in space. In the absence of methodical medical surveillance and care for those exposed to these health risks, we are irretrievably losing an invaluable source of data and severely hampering our plans to extend human exploration beyond low Earth orbit. The current and former astronaut cadre is the only study population that can facilitate our understanding of past and future space-related health risks. It is unforgivable to not monitor their health and collect and analyze the relevant associated data. I am a participant in the previously mentioned LSAH. Each year I travel to Houston and receive a medical check that includes collecting my vital signs, blood and urine samples, exams of my vision, hearing, and lung function, an EKG, and a brief physical exam by a flight surgeon. Every few years, it is recommended that I undergo a colonoscopy to look for polyps or tumors that may have appeared as a result of my exposure to ionizing radiation while on orbit. The procedure is completely voluntary, and if I do choose to have it done, the results are not, a priori, shared with NASA. This is just one example of the lack of monitoring that negatively affects our understanding of the epidemiology of spaceflight. Another valuable test that might be performed is high-powered MRI of my eyes to look for anatomical changes. Like about 60% of long-duration astronauts, I suffer from microgravity ocular syndrome, sometimes called vision impairment and intracranial pressure. VIIP is emerging as one of the most significant and least understood health risks for human exploration beyond low Earth orbit. It seems absurd that we do not actively study those who have suffered from it. During my 7 months aboard the ISS, my bone mineral density decreased by over 10%. While the density itself recovered after a couple of years, we don't fully understand if the structure of the bone, and therefore its resistance to fracture, has returned. A test like QCT, quantitative computed tomography, can not only measure bone mineral density, but also assess the geometry of the bone and the stress-strain index, a much better measure of fracture resistance. This test is also not performed as part of LSAH. What I found perhaps most startling in the responses from the ASC USA membership was how many reported that they have dropped out of the LSAH program. A relatively routine physical that lacks targeted surveillance of known space-related health hazards, let alone any kind of in-depth diagnosis or provision of treatment, is simply not compelling enough for many former astronauts who might live far from Houston to take time from work and family to make the trip. This means that not only is NASA deprived of any data related to spaceflight-specific health risks, even the routine surveillance that is part of today's LSAH is often being done by local medical providers, and the associated information is lost to NASA. There is a moral and ethical obligation on the part of any employer to exercise due diligence to study all occupational hazards that its employees encounter in the workplace, to understand the short and long-term health effects of those dangers, to use all reasonable methods to prevent these risks from negatively impacting the well-being of its current and future workers, and to provide care for former employees who suffer health issues as a result of their service. There are a number of significant human health risks associated with flying in space. Many of these perils are unique to the spaceflight environment, and most evade our full understanding. It's clear that we must do our utmost to mitigate these risks for the cadre of current and future American astronauts by assiduously monitoring the health and, where applicable, treatment of their predecessors. This information is absolutely imperative for the design of missions, vehicles, and countermeasures for the human exploration of space beyond low Earth orbit. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to answering questions from the subcommittee.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez-Alegria. And now I recognize Dr. Kahn for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Babin, Ranking Member Edwards, Committee Chairman Smith, and Ranking Member Johnson, thank you for the opportunity to present testimony on this timely and vitally important subject today. I'm a professor of bioethics and public policy at the Johns Hopkins University Berman Institute of Bioethics in Baltimore, and I should say, after the introduction of my fellow witnesses, a rank underachiever. I appear before you today in my capacity as chair of the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, Committee on Ethics, Principles, and Guidelines for Health Standards for Long-Duration and Exploration Spaceflights, which issued its report in April of 2014, as Representative Edwards has already noted. In addition, I should note that I'm currently chair of the Board on Health Sciences Policy, for the Health and Medicine Division of the National Academies and a member of the division's Standing Committee on Aerospace Medicine and Medicine of Extreme Environments. In those contexts, I will describe recommendations contained in the report of the committee I mentioned related to protecting and sustaining astronaut health. First, I want to say that my committee's report in 2014 was not the first to identify the ethical obligations to protect astronaut health, as has been noted by others. As outlined in the 2001 IOM report titled Safe Passage, and as noted in my committee's report as well, the new challenges that will be faced in long-duration and exploration spaceflight necessitate a new look at the ethics principles for these missions, and I quote now from Safe Passage. Current ethical standards for clinical research and practice with astronauts were developed in an era of short space missions when repeat missions were the norm and a return to Earth within days was possible. In future missions beyond Earth orbit, however, a diverse group of astronauts will travel to unexplored destinations for prolonged periods of time. Contact with Earth will be delayed, and a rapid return will be impossible. Long-duration missions beyond Earth orbit, space colony habitation, or interplanetary travel will create special circumstances for which ethical standards developed for terrestrial medical care and research may be inadequate for astronauts. These ethical standards may require re-evaluation. That again is from 2001. My committee in 2014 noted that NASA, as an employer, a federal agency responsible for innovation and exploration, a research sponsor, and an international partner, has moral obligations to formally recognize and act on responsibilities that logically flow from the ethics principles outlined in our report, if long-duration and exploration spaceflights are to be ethically acceptable. Among the 6 principles we identified, 2 are particularly relevant for discussion in the context of health care for former astronauts. Those principles are 1, fairness, and 2, as already noted by Representative Edwards, fidelity. Let me quote from the report. Fairness is the principle that requires that equals be treated equally, that burdens and benefits be distributed fairly, and that fair processes be created and followed. NASA's decision-making surrounding missions should explicitly address fairness, including the distribution of the risks and benefits of the mission, crew selection, and protections for astronauts after missions, end quote. An important ethical challenge of exposing humans to the risks of long-duration and exploration spaceflight is that the burden of the health risks associated with these missions falls to a limited number of astronauts and their families as well, while the benefits of the proposed missions accrue primarily to future astronauts and to society more broadly. In addition to being a concern of appropriate risk-benefit balance about going at all, the appropriate risk-benefit distribution must also be considered. Asking individuals to accept great risk, either in likelihood or magnitude of the harm to be caused, can be partially balanced by making a commitment to provide long-term health care and health monitoring. The second principle we identified is fidelity, and again I quote from the report. Fidelity is the principle that recognizes that individual sacrifices made for the benefit of society may give rise to societal duties in return. Given the risks that astronauts accept in participating in hazardous missions, NASA should respect the mutuality of obligations and ensure health care and protection for astronauts not only during the mission but after they return, including provision of lifetime health care for astronauts, end quote. Those who consent to incur long-term health risks for society's benefit are entitled to fidelity, reflected in society's commitment to minimize any harms that emerge whenever they emerge. The committee noted that this concept of fidelity or reciprocity resonates with the basic, widely shared understanding that it is unjust to allow some people alone to bear burdens which, in all fairness and justice, should be borne by the public as a whole. As a practical matter, the public cannot physically share the risks that astronauts will bear. It can, however, share the costs and burdens of ongoing risk mitigation efforts. An astronaut's consent becomes binding and irrevocable at the moment the mission launches. Astronauts are free to withdraw their agreement to participate prior to launch, of course, but from the launch moment forward, it becomes nearly impossible to turn back, and astronauts likely will encounter uncertain and unquantifiable risk exposures and endure potential harms to health that will persist after the mission. The irrevocability of participation in spaceflight creates an ethical imperative to define long-term duties owed to the participating astronaut. In this context, the principles identified by our committee report support the minimization of risk of harm, the treatment of injuries or health conditions during flight, and the ongoing monitoring and provision of health care after the flight. This binding duty to provide ongoing surveillance, monitoring, and health care during the lifetime of the astronaut is part of the continuum of risk management that begins with engineering and design efforts to minimize risk and continues through the flight and post-flight. Our committee concluded that the ethics responsibilities that result from sanctioning high-risk activities include continuous learning and engagement in health-related activities that protect astronaut health, support ongoing evaluation of health standards, improve mission safety, and reduce risks for current and future astronauts. Employers that knowingly expose employees to risks have an ethical responsibility to provide protection to the extent possible and to address the harms that occur when protections fail or turns out to be inadequate. Robust research and health monitoring or surveillance programs that fully inform all who are involved, including astronauts and their families, are required. Furthermore, the committee maintained that the nation, through NASA, has the ethical duties to protect and sustain astronaut health based on the ethics principles of fairness and fidelity. Providing lifetime health care to astronauts respects the commitment that our astronauts have made and the risks that they have taken on society's behalf. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kahn. All fascinating testimony. I thank every one of you witnesses for your testimony, and now I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. The first one I'd like to direct to Dr. Williams. How would additional authority affect existing rights and benefits under current statutes? And would creating a new program at NASA impact the standards that are set forth by the Departments of Labor and Veterans Affairs for compensation and treatment? In other words, will a new authority make it easier or harder for astronauts to receive the treatment and compensation that they're due?
Thank you for the question, sir. I don't think that there will be a major impact to existing infrastructure. As a matter of fact, we envision using an existing claims infrastructure, working very closely with our partners in the Department of Labor, and we're developing the same relationships with the Department of Veterans Affairs to approach this as a facilitated claims process, providing the expertise in space medicine and disease-specific experts, as well as the evidence base that we've accrued so far to help determine likelihood of association with occupational exposure as disease develops in our former and retired astronauts. With regard to your question about whether I think this will make it easier to advance the plausibility of association, I think it likely will, sir. I think endorsement by the Congress that in recognition that these unusual exposures can cause disease in our astronauts, I think that will send a powerful message and will enable us to be more successful in taking care of them.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Doctor. The next question I'd like to direct to our 3 distinguished astronauts. If NASA is given authority to provide additional treatment for astronauts beyond existing programs at the Department of Labor and Department of Veterans Affairs, should NASA provide that treatment in-house at NASA or reimburse patients for private sector treatment? Captain Cassidy, how about you first?
Mr. Chairman, that's an excellent question. I think that there's some degree of care that can be handled in-house at the Johnson Space Center, but I also think that there should be some flexibility in order to take care of the former astronauts who potentially in their older age have a hard time getting back to the Johnson Space Center, or if it's because of their condition can't make that trip.
Right, okay. Captain Kelly?
Yes, sir, I don't really have anything to add other than what Chris said, but I think, the emphasis on some of these guys being, as we age and traveling back and forth to Houston could be problematic.
Sure, thank you. And Captain Lopez-Alegria.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, pretty similar. I think clearly there are some things that the clinic at Johnson Space Center could not do from a medical perspective. We couldn't, treat somebody with chemotherapy, for instance, at JSC. But I think to the extent possible, we should try to keep it in-house just to facilitate the transfer of the data, which are very important to the discussion. But agree with my colleagues about that being impractical in some cases. I think that we should endeavor to make it happen when possible. but realize that that won't always be the case.
Sure. And then just to follow up, if NASA does decide to diagnose and treat conditions in-house, does this pose a potential conflict of interest when NASA is financially obligated to compensate former astronauts for conditions caused by their federal service? If one of you three would like to take a stab at that.
Well, let me start by saying, and Scott will back me up on this, as military aviators, we have an adversarial relationship with our flight surgeons generally. I was expecting that to be the case at NASA and could not have been more wrong about that. The relationship that we enjoy is very unique, and there's no doubt in my mind that our best interests are at heart when they give us treatment. So I would have a great level of confidence that the people with whom we all have personal relationships would be very disposed to help us to the extent possible. And I don't see there being a conflict of interest. I think that it would be, if you're saying the conflict of interest would be they would be reluctant, I don't see that as a likelihood.
Right. Anybody else pretty much in agreement? It's an interesting comment you made, because I was an Air Force dentist, and occasionally we had to put DNIF on somebody's records, and they were not happy. Duty not to include flying. Let's see, I think I'm out of time, so I will yield back, and we will call on the next one, the ranking member from Maryland, Ms. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to the witnesses. Your testimony was really just very thorough. One of the questions that I had as we came up, and particularly for Captain Lopez-Alegria, if you could tell me whether the care is provided in-house or out-of-house in terms of the surveillance data that are gathered, and Dr. Williams, please contribute as well. It seems to me that you all are already close to, or you already have a tool a screening tool that could easily be used more broadly, whether that's at Johnson or at some private care facility. And the question is whether we can authorize both the mechanism for surveillance, but also separately the provision of health care, in which case you would be able to capture more than the 60%, I think, of the astronaut corps, retired and active, who are currently participating. Would that be right?
Well, I think your last point would absolutely be right, that you would have far more participation than we have. I don't know enough about what the current limits of the authority on the screening that are in place right now, but I do know that some of the tests that I mentioned in my oral testimony, which could be done, which are very specifically targeted to hazards that are known to be caused by flying in space, are not being done. And I think that if that authority does not exist, which I assume it doesn't, or we would be doing them, then they should be.
Dr. Williams?
Yes, ma'am. Our current authority to provide that ongoing health monitoring to former and retired astronauts is limited. Our ability to spend appropriated funds in providing that diagnosis and much more so in providing treatment among that group, we don't feel like we have the authority to do that. So although we have the basic framework in place, which is the lifetime surveillance of astronaut health, we believe that that framework can be greatly enhanced and greatly expanded and become much more comprehensive with specific authority to provide diagnosis and treatment. Similarly, we think that our ability to engage and treat serious illness that arises in the astronaut corps will be greatly facilitated by for the lack of a better word, I'd say the facilitated claims process we envision with our partnerships with the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Labor.
So, I mean, I want to get to this because I think there's a separate question. If we give the authority that then allows for the provision of health care, that we could do that either through those who are covered by VA, those who are covered under the FECA, or other kinds of private health care. The question then becomes, can we develop a tool that encompasses all of the kind of surveillance that you would need, both to provide current health care, but also to look down the line in terms of providing prevention or looking forward to the future astronaut corps. And you're saying that we would need, you would require a separate legislative authority in order to be able to do that?
Yes, ma'am. I think based on the very small number of cadre of the astronauts and the very unique exposures and the need for targeted surveillance and broad preventive surveillance in this group, targeted toward those exposures that we know more about than anyone else on the planet. I think that NASA having that care, we do have within our agency a comprehensive health care delivery system that is aimed at the active astronaut corps. And leveraging our abilities along those lines on behalf of the retired and former astronauts, including helping coordinate their care wherever they live, I think would go a great way toward making sure that we take care of them and recovering as much data as possible to establish our evidence base.
And Captain Cassidy, I take it that you believe that that Congress has to provide a broader legislative authority to provide those services.
Yes, ma'am. I think that it's my experience base is with the active astronauts, and like my two colleagues here, I don't have a whole lot of experience with what it's like as a former astronaut to go through that. I've talked to both of them, but where I think we can do, I know we can do a better job at pulling this data together. And the execution of how we do that, where it happens, what tests are done, and the mechanism for payment, I think are things that can be further honed and discussed as we move forward and actually get this going. But those are things that I think we could collectively get a better story on.
And Dr. Kahn, can you tell me, is there any other sector that you can think of where there's an employer who has an employee who engages in risk for the purposes of completing their employment, where there isn't a comparative ethical obligation for care?
Thank you, Representative Edwards. It's a really interesting question, and in fact, part of the work of the committee that I had the privilege to chair, we tried to find parallel occupational examples, and in fact, it's quite unique, is the short answer. And so when people leave occupational environment, they tend to have either a new job or they become retired, and then they're covered by other means. So astronauts are really, frankly, in a unique category that way.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. I now call on the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Captain Kelly, thank you, sir, for being here today and for your service to America's space program. As many are aware, you and your twin brother, Mark Kelly, are providing scientists with a wealth of information of the effect that human spaceflight has on the body. NASA is set to share the results of the study next year. Are you in a position where you can give us any previews of what they're finding so far by sharing with us the most surprising or interesting things that you have noticed so far?
Well, I mentioned in my testimony the difference between my initial 159-day flight and 340, my symptoms immediately upon return. I have gotten some data back, my bone mass, muscle mass data, some of the data on my vision, that for me, I was kind of surprised that it was relatively flat in comparison to the 159 days. In other words, being in space for twice as long didn't mean that I lost twice as much bone mass. It was pretty similar. So I think some of these we do have some, a good understanding to how to mitigate the risks to bone and muscle loss so we can stay in space longer. The data with regards to my brother and the comparison with me, a lot of those samples just came back on SpaceX, my biological samples. So, like most research, you collect the data, you analyze the data, you write the reports, have it peer-reviewed. I think that type of genetic data, the effects of the radiation environment, the effects on my immune system, things like that, as it compares to my brother, are just going to take much longer. But I was actually, pleasantly surprised that my bone and muscle data was pretty much flat between the two flights, although how I felt when I got back was much different.
And this is a question for each of you, though I'd like to start with the astronauts, Captain Cassidy first, working our way around, and then on the two ends of the table, whoever wants to follow them, feel free. With current technology, can NASA safely send an astronaut on a Mars mission without resulting significant adverse health risk? And if not, what should be done to safely protect astronauts on a Mars mission?
So that's a fantastic question, because that's where I think our nation should go to Mars, and that's where our vision is. And so how do we do that effectively and safely is a fantastic thing to consider. And clearly radiation monitoring and protection is critically important there. Do I think that we could do that mission safely right now? We could do it as safely as we think we can, and the risks that there are certain risks that we don't know, and that's where collecting this data between now and going to Mars will keep my future colleagues safer.
Captain Kelly.
Yes, sir. So, my time on the space station, I was really inspired that building and operating this vehicle was the most difficult thing we have ever done. And I think it's proven that if we decide to do something and we set our mind to it and put the resources behind it, we can be successful, whether that's going to Mars or curing cancer. If we decide that that's what we're going to do and we devote the appropriate resources to do it, we can do it. Now, there are challenges with going to Mars. Chris mentioned radiation, which I completely agree with. I think the physical challenges, that would be the number one concern I would have, is protecting the crew members on that long trip away from the protection of Earth. I think there are also, challenges in the systems that keep us alive on board the space station. These are designed to work for long periods of time in low Earth orbit, but having them that can, operate consistently, reliably, get us to Mars and back is a challenge. But I think it's clearly a challenge that if we decide that's what we want to do, then we can accomplish it.
Well, with respect to the number one concern that both of you have mentioned, radiation, do we have the technology now to protect our astronauts from the radiation of a long-term flight to Mars and back, or do we need to develop new technology?
I think there's two ways to approach that. One is you get there really fast, so you're not exposed to the radiation environment for as long. And the other one is some means of, insulating the crew members from it. And I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is if you have a propulsion system that potentially has a magnetic field as part of it, that can act like the magnetic field of the Earth to protect us from certain types of radiation. But again, I'm not an expert in this area.
Captain Lopez-Alegria.
Thank you, Representative Brooks. I think, could we do it technologically? Perhaps. It would be incredibly expensive. The things that you mentioned, my colleagues have mentioned about radiation, you could shield, that takes mass, that makes the vehicle heavier, that makes the vehicle more expensive. The current propulsion technology, we've heard how long it would take the mission. We'd have to bring our food with us. There are so many things that it's possible to do. I think a breakthrough in technology would make a lot of those problems go away, or at least become much more easily to solve. One thing that I do think is going to happen in almost any case, it's going to be very difficult to have any kind of a reasonable abort possibility once you're on your way. And so this country is going to have a different risk acceptance posture, not just for radiation exposure, which is right now 3% above the normal population is what we admit for a risk of exposure-induced death. That will probably have to change. But also just the notion that somebody could have an unforeseen medical problem on orbit or on the way, which today we could have the crew member on the ground in a matter of hours. It would take potentially months to get them back. So we could do it. I think we have to go through some evolutionary processes in the way we think, both at NASA and as a country, for it to happen.
Well, my time has expired, but if the chair would permit for Dr. Kahn and Dr. Williams to answer, that'd be great. But if not...
No, certainly. Go ahead if you have something
Thank
to
you.
add to that.
Dr. Kahn or Dr. Williams, would either of you like to add anything to a Mars mission, safety, technological advances we might need to ensure health safety?
So I think my colleagues covered it quite well. Physiologically, we believe that we could send people on a Mars duration mission out and back, all the other safety concerns notwithstanding. We believe we could do that. Physiologically, I think it's safe to say that those astronauts would be forever changed. They would have a greater risk of developing, in all likelihood, they'd have a greater risk of developing a fatal cancer during their lifetime. There are and the associated changes in bone and muscle. I mean, they may have greater fracture risks and the cataracts and all the things we've talked about. One of the great challenges are the unknowns, and there are unknowns and unknown unknowns with regard to the increased duration of spaceflight. So that's what makes it so imperative for us to continue our studies and to continue gathering as much data as we possibly can in support of an eventual Mars mission.
Dr. Kahn, do you have anything to add?
I would just add to what Dr. Williams just had to say that the committee that I chaired actually understood that there were such great unknowns and unquantifiable risks, and rather than try to answer the question that you posed about what technological breakthroughs would be necessary or whether we could do it today, we gave them a framework to think about the ethics of exceeding existing standards and how to think about that. Since, as Captain Lopez-Alegria said, there are existing health standards, and we have to evaluate those standards in light of the mission that is being proposed, and that's what the committee that I chaired had to say.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'd like to now call on the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you very much for being here. Dr. Kahn, given the difficulty of establishing causality for medical conditions that may have resulted from human spaceflight, one of the options would be to have NASA take care of all the medical problems that astronauts would have in the years to come. What are the pros and cons of such an approach?
Thank you, Representative Byer, for that question. I think that's actually a really important question, and I'll speak to it from the ethics perspective because that's what I know. And in fact, the committee that I chaired discussed that, and we came to the conclusion that the causality question is impossible to answer, and that we, as a country and a society, owe astronauts protection and provision of care throughout their lifetimes without asking the question about whether what they might suffer from in terms of injury or health needs was a result of their time in space or not.
Thank you, Dr. Kahn. I met earlier today with the fire chief for the county of Arlington in Virginia and talked specifically about this issue with the presumption of heart-lung disease, it's called heart-lung presumption, that if they got heart disease or lung disease later, that it was presumed to be from rushing into burning buildings and buildings with that. And he said it actually been expanded in Virginia over the law to things to do with the GI tract also. So this just extends it to all those who go into space for us.
And as you heard from others, there's new information coming out all the time. And so what we don't know today may be something we learn about in the future. And so the committee that I chaired really did not find the causation question a compelling one as a matter of limitation of provision of lifetime health care benefits.
I'm struck today by the two big reasons we have this hearing. The one hand is the ethical considerations, the responsibility to take care of people who are sacrificing for all humankind. The other hand, there's the simple practical data reason that we want to learn as much as we can to be able to move forward. Dr. Williams, what about when Captain Kelly retires and goes to work for a private space person, SpaceX or Orbital? How does that influence the government's responsibility to take care of him and his space things for his space-related conditions for years to come?
Yes, sir. Another great question. I think there's plenty of precedent in the U.S. government that we would consider that to have no impact at all on our ethical obligation to take care of Captain Kelly and on our desire to gather as much data as we can to inform our database and to help us protect crews in the future. So I think there's no accrual, no effect at all, sir.
I was very impressed, fascinated by reading Captain Kelly, all the impacts of your 340 days in space, everything from the rash to the flu-like symptoms and all the things we don't know yet, the unknown unknowns. So Dr. Kahn, from an ethical standpoint, especially after the recent death of Muhammad Ali, I mean, my mother never wanted me to box, right? The concussion and what the NFL is trying to deal with concussions right now, we see those are voluntary sports. At what point do the ethical considerations become so great that we become reluctant to send men and women into space for the long voyages?
At what point would they? Is that your question?
We send young men and women to go fight for us overseas because they're defending the country and we know we're going to lose some. We don't ever want to lose anybody. Despite Elon Musk saying the other day, we're going to go to Mars and some people are going to die. Do we go into this knowing with certainty that some of these health effects, the long-term health effects, are going to be inevitable?
I think what we want to be sure of, as sure as we can be, that we can protect the men and women who go into long-duration spaceflight to the greatest extent possible, and that we learn along the way. So among the things that hasn't come out yet today is this notion of long duration. So we're talking hundreds of days in transit until there's some new propulsion system. And so we can learn along the way. So data will come back to Earth from the experience of astronauts as they fly, and we should use that and learn and use that to decide about whether people should spend more time in protective cocoons in the on the way, or whether there should be some other means by which we should modify exposure along the way. So I think it's a notion of learning as we go, but we don't go until we're sufficiently confident that it's safe enough. And then it's up to NASA to decide when and if it's safe enough.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. It's fascinating. It's important. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. Dr. Kahn, I want to start with you because I thought your two sort of pillars of fidelity and fairness really kind of lay out the thinking on this for me. If somebody, these three gentlemen next to you are explorers, and they put themselves at risk to explore in the name of the United States, in the name of science, in the name of adventure, in the name of I don't know what, lots of things. And they now have put themselves at risk. So it's my opinion, based on your two principles of fidelity and fairness, that we have a responsibility to provide both the medical care that they may need on into the future and the research that they provide us as to their health. So, did your committee agree with you on this fidelity and fairness? It certainly resonates with me.
Yeah, sorry if I wasn't clear, Representative Perlmutter. My testimony represents the conclusions of the committee that I chaired, and everything I said actually is a summary of what's in our report, which was issued in 2014. And so that was the consensus of those 16 people who have a variety of expertise, some like mine, but actually two former astronauts were members of this committee, along with scientists and physicians and occupational health specialists.
Well, the reason I'm sort of thinking about this, and Dr. Williams, you can chime in if you choose. My district, we have Rocky Flats, where we built the nuclear triggers for our bombs. And we had a lot of workers out there. They've developed a number of maladies. As a result, some, I guess, anticipated, some not anticipated. And we came up with the Congress, came up with the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Program, which has worked in some regards and hasn't worked very well in other regards because, whether it's bone mass or some issue of radiation or something like cataracts, completely unexpected, we've seen maladies that were never expected. So in your analysis, Dr. Williams or Dr. Kahn, how do we be inclusive? Do we just, see, right now the burden is on the worker to say that the illness came from working at Rocky Flats. I just like to say, hey, if you worked at Rocky Flats and you're sick, we're going to take care of you. If you're an astronaut and you've gone up there, we're going to take care of you. But it gets expensive. We've got to be prepared for potential costs if we build our astronaut base. I mean, what was your committee considering? And Dr. Williams, have we estimated what costs we might see in the future?
So the committee that I chaired did not was not asked and did not try to estimate the cost. So we identified what we thought were the, as you articulated, the pillars. We called them principles of ethics that would support recommendations, which included a recommendation for lifetime provision of health care for astronauts. But we did not go past that into the practical question of how much it would cost for how many people or for how many years we're discussing.
Dr. Williams.
Yes, sir. I think when you articulated the sentiment that if we send you in harm's way as astronauts, we want to take care of you, I think that's what NASA absolutely wants to do. The practicalities of doing that with this legislation, we have to be aware of the problems, hopefully at the earliest stage possible in order to remediate them. And that's the monitoring portion of the health monitoring portion of our proposal, which is quite detailed and quite targeted and broadly preventive in nature. And then I think with this authority, we could work very closely under the Envision model, work very closely with folks in existing claim structures, the DOL and the VA, whoever we need to lean very far forward and be very proactive with regard to providing evidence and best expert opinion to try to receive favorable consideration of claims and acceptance of diseases as they arise.
Okay, well, for all of us on this committee, I think I showed you, Captain Kelly, when you were up on the space station, 2033 we can do this. I mean, we really want, I know, exactly what the timing is going to be. That'll be for the technicians and the engineers and you astronauts and the scientists to figure it out, but we want to get there. But we want you not to put your lives at stake. I mean, there'll be some level of risk. I know I, as a member of Congress, on behalf of the 750,000 people that I represent, want to make sure that when you do put your lives at risk, and your health for who knows how long down the road, we, as the United States of America, help you with your health care. Whatever, hopefully there's no problems, but if there are, we help you. And so just thank you for your service, gentlemen. Docs, thank you for looking at this. This is important stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. I think there's a little time left if we could go back through for another round of questioning, if the witnesses are agreeable and the members. Why don't we do this for, instead of 5 minutes, we'll have a 2-minute question period, okay? And Mr. Perlmutter, we're going to keep you at 30 seconds. Okay, I want to start out with Dr. Williams. Similar to the question that Mr. Perlmutter asked, NASA has indicated that extending existing monitoring of former astronauts would increase the cost to NASA from approximately $400,000 a year to around $800,000 a year. A recent University of Nebraska Medical Center report indicated that providing medical care for all 367 astronauts and their families would cost between $2.4 and $6.5 million a year. How much money would NASA's current proposal cost per year? Do you know that?
We think the direct portion, health monitoring portion, would be in the neighborhood of doubling our current cost to $800,000 a year. Right now, we spend $400,000 a year for that portion. We believe if we, including remunerating providers in the community for testing and imaging and so on and so forth, we think that would drive that cost up to, and anticipating increased participation rates, we think it would drive it to 800,000. With regard to the remediation of illness and injury, the astronauts do display a very strong, healthy worker effect. They pursue very healthy lifestyles. They're committed during their careers and after their careers to maintaining good fitness and making good lifestyle choices. So when you compare chronic diseases and malignancies and so on and so forth to almost any comparison groups at this point, the astronauts compare very favorably. After latent period of exposure passes in the next 10 to 20 years, that's an unknown quantity at that point. But right now, we would anticipate, based on historical precedent, no more than one case, maybe 2 cases every 1 or 2 years of significant illness that would be expensive. And by expensive, I mean that would be in the $500,000 range for a catastrophic case of cancer or something. That's what we believe we would be dealing with in the short term, sir.
And one quick question here for you, Dr. Williams and Captain Cassidy. The Department of Labor and Department of Veterans Affairs both provide treatment for conditions derived from federal service. Are there classes of astronauts, such as payload specialists, who are not government employees and therefore would not be covered by existing authorities? Do y'all know the answer to that?
Oh, sir, currently at NASA we have active astronauts and management astronauts. Management astronauts are folks that still work at NASA but are no longer in the line for a space mission. And we used to have, in the past, payload specialists. We no longer have that designation. However, from our perspective, anybody that goes on a space mission, on a NASA mission, should be covered.
Right. Dr. Williams.
And sir, for classes of astronauts like the payload specialists, we believe that no matter what method they use to enter the agency as a detailee or what method of employment they had, that there would be a pathway forward under existing structure to treat them just like we would any astronaut in clearly military or civilian service and pursue helping them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I now call on the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the second round. Dr. Williams, I want to go back to the VA system because I understand that about 60% of the astronauts that have flown in space are military or retired military. We have 2 here on this panel. And as such, any occupational injuries or conditions are currently handled by the VA. Have you actually directly addressed with the VA how occupational-related health conditions for former military astronauts as a result of spaceflight will be handled if this legislative proposal is enacted?
We have reached out to our contacts in the Veterans Administration, and we are initiating discussions with them similar to those that we have initiated with the Department of Labor. And we would envision in the implementation of this legislation partnerships going forward on both fronts to build this facilitated claims process, with NASA playing a key role in determining, accepting the diseases.
I mean, it is a little bit problematic that 60% of the astronauts are retired military, and you haven't engaged the VA in this discussion before presenting a legislative proposal. But I hope that happens really soon and that you're able to share that information with us. Captain Kelly and Captain Lopez-Alegria, you both are retired military. Have you used the existing VA system?
Yeah, I think it's important. I think it's important to point out that there are astronauts come from all different backgrounds. Some of us are retired military. I'm personally, as is Mike, covered under TRICARE for life as a retired military member. If you were a member of the military and you didn't retire, I believe the VA would still cover you. There are members of the astronaut corps that are civil servants. Some of those civil servants retire from federal service, in which case they do have retired civil service health care. But then there are other people that may fly for one flight or more and then leave federal service without any kind of long-term health care benefits until they were potentially eligible for Medicare. So there are different categories, and I think this system, if this legislation, if enacted, would benefit them and people in different ways, considering the fact that we already have health care coverage that is pretty good.
And in effect, at least bring the payment within one house, if not the care within one house.
Certainly, and I think the other important factor, as previously mentioned, is the fact that we can collect all this data. Whereas if I'm, living in another state and I'm being treated under the TRICARE system, NASA doesn't directly benefit from any of that information. And also the fact that, those healthcare providers may not even know what they should be looking for in these types of, cancer or radiation-based illnesses. It's interesting, Mike and I was going to point this out. I don't think you would mind mentioning it, but we're going to meet with one of our colleagues tonight that who lives in the area that has recently been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and he's, flown in space on a number of occasions, and we never know whether that's actually directly related to his spaceflight, but it's possible that it is.
Thank you very much. Reminder, it took us 30 years after Vietnam to finally recognize the long-term impacts of Agent Orange.
Yeah, absolutely. The next one, Mr. Byer, for a gentleman from Virginia.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Williams, I know you're not a statistician, but I understand from reading lots of science magazines that essentially we need to get to 10,000 DNA complete disarticulations into the database before we're really going to be able to figure out what some of these DNA connections are. I know we have 250 retired astronauts, 60% are in, so 150 are in that LSAH program right now. We moved to 80%, that gets us 200. What's the implications for us of the limited sample size, the limited size of the database?
It's something we've always struggled with, sir, whether we're actually doing space-based research with a small population and trying to, reach conclusions, or whether we're trying to do epidemiology on this very small, very uniquely exposed group of folks. The thing I think that is most important to note is that given the group is so small, the data from every single one of them is precious, and the data from every single one of them is important. And anything we can do to maximize participation in our program, both for the surveillance and recovery of healthcare data in the event of injury and illness, is critical.
A question for any of the three captains, but perhaps especially for Captain Kelly. We had a Mars hearing here a couple of weeks ago, and with the big companies that are developing all the places to get there. And Andy Weir came, who wrote The Martian. And at the end, he threw out the proposal that we should be thinking about using rotational energy to create artificial gravity on the way up. So how much of the consequences that you all have felt have been radiation-related versus gravity-free related? And I say that because I think for Ed and for me, the highlight of this committee so far has been when you and Dr. Lindgren did your flips at the end of the site. So,
well, I believe all the symptoms that we have, the stuff that we can feel when we get back, is a result of the microgravity environment versus the radiation. I think the radiation effects are, more long-term and unknown. If someone does develop a cancer, whether or not that was due to the radiation, I don't think we can ever say for sure, because they may have, we get radiation here on Earth as well. It just increases our risk of those type of cancers. So as far as, having a artificial gravity to mitigate those risks, I think, based on how I felt after being in space for a year, if I was going to travel to Europa, for instance, and it's going to take, many, many years to get there, I think, and then you had to perform after being in space for multiple years away, and you had to perform away from Earth, I think that type of artificial gravity would be crucial. If we're going to fly around the moon or fly around Mars, for instance, then it's going to take 3 years, and you'd be in space for 3 years. Or if you're going to land and be on the surface for a few weeks, being in space for an extended period of time is going to have a negative effect. But fortunately, you're coming back to Earth, where there's a big system to support you. So artificial gravity in that type of mission, I think, is less critical.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Byron. Now for the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
For my 30 seconds.
No, we'll give you 2.
So this is to all of you. So as things have developed, and we've heard from Mr. Musk and SpaceX that, you know, their intentions to try to get astronauts to Mars in the 2020 timeframe or sometime, and we know that there's going to be more commercial endeavors in space. So we have a small pool to do research on. Should we consider those astronauts that are on a private capsule, should they be covered by something like this? And I'll start with the 3 captains and then go to the ethicist, I guess.
Well, I've been in this room a lot, wearing my hat as the president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. So your comments about the democratization of access to space are near and dear to my heart. I think that we would love to have the data from those folks that are going to be going, you know, first on suborbital, but at some point on orbital flights. I do not think it is a responsibility ethically. I would leave that to the ethicist, but it seems to me that it would have to be a voluntary program for them. But what is clear is that the data that we are gathering in LSAH, and hopefully with this expanded authority, our flights and our careers have been paid for by taxpayer dollars, and we owe those taxpayers those data to help them make informed decisions about spaceflight.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add other than what Mike said. I think that's makes a lot of sense.
And, sir, I concur as well.
Okay, so to the doctors, do you want to have a bigger pool? You want them in there? Should we cover them? What do you think?
Well, so I'll start. I think in terms of coverage that if it's commercial spaceflight, then those companies ought to take on that obligation. So I do think there's an obligation, but not on the part of the government to protect those people, but on the part of Elon Musk or whomever. In terms of the data, that to me is something that ought to be encouraged, but I think it's hard to obligate on the part of the individual. So, I think as our astronaut colleagues here will say, there's very few of them, and that every bit of the data is precious. And with the proper protections, there should be, I think, a lot of willingness to participate. But I don't think you can force people to do that.
And, sir, I think our database and our experience base would form the risk assessment database that the commercial companies are going to have to use. That's going to inform their risk decisions when it comes to a health standpoint in undertaking some of these longer missions. I agree with my colleagues. From a practical perspective, our healthcare infrastructure, and I'm sure our research community too, would pursue helping them as much as we could by sharing our experience and our data as much as we can. And also, we would seek to facilitate their gathering of data. We have a lot of experience in doing that. And if there were opportunities to leverage their data on behalf of future human spaceflight, we would welcome the opportunity to do so.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. I want to thank the witnesses. It's been an extremely edifying hearing, and to be honored with the 3 astronauts and the 2 doctors. Thank you all for your many years of service to your country, and really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional written comments and written questions from the members. So, without any further ado, this hearing is adjourned.